C'est avec grand plaisir que je vous accueille à cette partie de la conférence au sujet de l'histoire des Noirs en éducation française et l'enseignement du programme STEM, sciences, technologies, ingénierie et mathématiques à travers le Canada. Good afternoon and welcome to session 3. And allow me to introduce our panelists who will be presenting on various aspects of Black history in French education and teaching in STEM across Canada. First up, we have Nikita Fester, who is a French immersion department head, social studies, and French language arts teacher in Vancouver, BC, and is the pilot educator for the district course, History of African Descent in BC 12. Prior to the launch of this course, she sat on an ad hoc advisory committee to the Ministry of Education regarding the inclusion of Black Canadian history within the K-12 curriculum. Presently, she is part of the planning and execution team for UBC's Black Futures program, which supports the transition of high school students to post-secondary institutions. Additionally, she provides mentorship, professional development workshops, and speaking engagements to pre- and in-service teachers on the inclusion of equity and diversity practices in the classroom and teacher activism. Within the district, she has supported and developed the first youth summit on anti-racism and the first district mandated in-service training on anti-racism. An alumnus of the University of British Columbia, Nikita is presently completing her Master's of Diversity Education through the University of Western Ontario. Today, she will be presenting on piloting history of African descent in BC 12, finding joy in the journey. Our next presenter is Christian Mbanza, I think I got that right, who is an educator in Regina, Saskatchewan. He first earned his education from the University of Regina, where he studied French with a history minor. Professionally, he sits on the board of the BIPOC Teachers Association, which strives to create a safe space for BIPOC educators. He is the Community Outreach Director for Black in Sask, BIS, a nonprofit organization which contributes to the holistic growth of Black community in Saskatchewan. Academically, he is in the process of completing his inclusive education certificate to facilitate the implementation of evaluating diverse learners in the classroom and his master's degree in educational psychology. Christian has devoted an important portion of his job to cultivating relationships with staff, children, and parents of diverse backgrounds. He has dedicated his career to celebrating Blackness, addressing social issues, and making progress for the Afro-Canadian community. He will present today on anti-Black history in education. Next up, we have Dr. Jennifer Adams. Dr. Adams is a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair of Creativity and Science and Associate Professor at the University of Calgary. She is the PI of the Creativity, Equity, and STEM Lab, where she and her team research equity in STEM teaching and learning environments with an emphasis on identity-affirming, anti-deficit, and justice-oriented approaches. She collaborates with scholars across Canada at the LEAD Advancing Racial Equity in STEM in Canada, such as Securing Black Futures, which seeks to increase the visibility and support the flourishing of Black students in STEM. She is an NSF Early Career Award recipient and has served on the executive board of the National Association of Research in Science Teaching. Her prior appointments include Brooklyn College at the Graduate Center, CUNY, New York City Public Schools, and the American Museum of Natural History. Her presentation today focuses on centering identity and joy in STEM education for Black learners. Last but not least, we have Leslie Clott. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's close enough. Okay, thank you. Leslie is a PhD student in the Faculty of Education at Brock University. Her research focuses on the experiences of global majority students in Ontario schools. She is also a 21-year veteran secondary school teacher and science department head. The title of this presentation, of Leslie's presentation, is Incorporating Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy into STEM, Ensuring Black Students See Themselves in Canadian Classrooms. Let's give it up for our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the program. Oh, geez. I see what the. I understand that other presenters struggle. Thank you so much for having me here today. And just following the protocol, I recognize that we are gathering on the unceded traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq. And my work context, I'm situated on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Also acknowledging the work of our ancestors on whose shoulders I stand on as I present to you today, and bringing it just a step forward, all of the presenters who've spoken before me, how inspirational. I am so inspired and energized, and wow, there's so much good work, important work being done. So I acknowledge all of that work as well, so thank you so much. Today I'm going to be talking about a course called BC Black History 12, which is the one course that I teach in English. I am a French immersion teacher, but for the purposes of this symposium, I'll be talking about a course that I teach in English. Maybe one day it'll be offered in French as well. So, how did we get here? BC Black History came about through a lot of pressure from activists, teachers, parents, students, which then led to the development of a curriculum. And of course, that curriculum needed to get approved by a school board. So it was offered to several different school boards. Vancouver took it on, and it was adopted as a board authorized and approved course. So this is great because that means we can teach the course. However, it is offered as an elective because it's not been approved by the ministry. So for those of you going about this work of getting official social studies curriculums adopted, just pay attention to that little loophole. It was one thing we didn't recognize until we were kind of up and running, and now we're in the works of trying to get the ministry approval, so it is now an official social studies course instead of just an elective for our students. What I'm really happy about with this course is that it's offered district-wide, so all students in Vancouver are eligible to sign up for this course. You don't have to be a student at my home school. So again, we're responding to the needs of all the Black students and interested students in the district instead of just having it localized at one school site. So once we'd gone through all of those steps, I then decided to chat with my students because as a teacher, I get really excited about some things, and then I present it to the kids, and they're not as excited. So chatting with my students, what would be interesting to teach? What are you passionate about? What would draw folks in and get them excited about what we're learning? And then that just led to course promotion and gathering the excitement and engagement from students across the district. So in our first run, which was from the 2020 2021-2022 school year, so this year that just finished, we actually had 30 students signed up. So my class was at CAP, which was really exciting, and we have a good, healthy turnout for next year as well, with about 26 students registered in the course. So the foundation of this course for me was based off of two major ideas: urgent pedagogies by Dr. Goldie Muhammad and curricular violence. So urgent pedagogies is any pedagogy that is relevant and responsive to students' ideas. And a previous speaker mentioned responsible, and if I could change my presentation, I would then add in responsible to student identities. So how they identify how they're showing up in class. It also encourages us to hold students capable. So recognizing that they all have their own genius, their own abilities, and allowing them to step into that space of leadership and ability to show what they can do, to empower them to take action and really step into their agency. It also disrupts racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. So now that you're aware of what you have, how can you use that to change the narrative and uplift and center others? It endorses criticality, so we're again encouraging students' critical thinking around power dynamics, equity, and disrupting that oppression. So it's not just about knowing what you know and what you have, but what are you going to do with that knowledge? Secondly, curricular violence. Now, this was important for me to keep in the back of my mind because my very limited experience learning about Black history in school started and stopped with slavery. When I talked to my colleagues, oh, for Black history, you know, I got this really good documentary about lynchings in the South. Great. And so oftentimes these resources are very accessible. And we're looking to teach on some of these difficult histories. If we're looking to teach on Indigenous history, it's really easy to find a bunch of documentaries, resources on residential schools and the 60s scoop. And for Black history, slavery, and Jim Crow laws. But when we decide to incorporate those resources into our classrooms, what we're not acknowledging is the harm that we can do to our students. We are rooting Black history in a narrative of trauma and oppression, of pain and death, and that is harmful. It's also teaching our non-Black students that Black people exist within this narrative. And what I wanted to make sure that I was doing was demonstrating that we exist outside of this. There's more to our story than the trauma and the pain. So, being a teacher, some moments to reflect. Just consider your own learning journey. Were you ever taught about your own history, and what was that experience like? So just a few moments to reflect. Low risk, high reward. I won't be calling on anyone to share their thoughts. And then following that reflection, how could your educators teach your history in a way that was uplifting for you and your community? What would that feel like? So when I'm engaging with my students, I like to try and target the affective and the cognitive. And so I need them to recognize their humanity, the humanity of others, and then we'll tap into the nitty-gritty, the context, the language, the vocabulary, all that they need to go out and be agents of change. But first, I just want to recognize that we have feelings, we're humans. I'm seeing a person that is experiencing all of these things, not just the experience itself. So with that as my foundation, I went on to create the big ideas for this course. In BC, all of our curriculums are supposed to be based off of the First Nations principles of learning. So there's 9 principles, and I have several big ideas for this course, but I just wanted to highlight a few of them. So the Indigenous learning principles are written in green, and then the big idea for the course is underneath in black. The one I would like to highlight, which I find particularly important and relevant to everything that's been discussed, is learning involves generational roles and responsibilities. And underneath, absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. And I think that's very important when we're looking at the context of teaching Black history, because it is so hard to find the information. It really does take a commitment to identify the resources, the materials that you can use, and then within the context of teaching, translating that information into something that's accessible and informative for our students. So with that in mind, we have a responsibility to bring to light all stories and histories that have been excluded by those who have held positions of power and influence. So again, the agency, what are we doing with this knowledge now that we have it? So that's kind of the genesis of this course. Now I'm going to go into what we did throughout the year, and just kind of funny that I didn't get through my curriculum this year, and now I think that I'm going to get through my curriculum in 20 minutes, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. I started off the course with a poem called Black and Canadian by Lyle E. Talbot, which anchored the course, offered a window to the past and to the present, and rooted our course in the Canadian context. My students, my Black students, but the majority of my students, when they think of what it means to be Black, they think of America. So let's situate ourselves within Canada. I don't know how clear it is, and I am not a poet, so I'll just read a little bit of this poem. It's about 4 pages long. This is just the first few stanzas. Blackness is what? A pigmentation of the skin, a texture of the hair, nostrils that flare, lips seldom thin, a toothy grin? Or is it but a state of mind, an attitude toward white mankind, a pride in being Black, you say, a history from us hid away, a feeling of somehow being right, even in conflict with the white, a Black is beautiful type of pride, a free and easy soulful stride? Is it knowing how to sing and dance and do our thing, or bad talking with the man and hurling curses at the clan, Western Guard or migration ban? Blackness to many of us means to have the door slammed in our face, to lose a chance because of race, to study hard to get ahead, but to find the road blocked instead, to tell our kids to stay in school, that things will change, just keep your cool. It is knowing limits, bounds, taboos, and how to play the game and lose. So what does this poem help us understand about the Black Canadian experience is just an invitation I have for you. And how can you use poetry in your context as an entry to critical discussions? So I like to explore several different literacies to engage my students and offer them different opportunities to engage with the topics of conversation. So for example, at the beginning of the year, I started my class off with Beyonce's Coachella performance, Stomping the Yard, and Call and Response. My students looked at me like, wow, Madame Fester's wild. What does that have to do with BC Black history? In the Coachella performance, Beyonce presented a whole display, I'd say, or performance with costumes around ancient Egypt. The first university was in Africa. So when they think of where do I belong, do I see myself in post-secondary? Guess what? We were first. Stomping the yard and dancing, a culture that they engage with all the time, comes from gumboot dancing in South Africa. Call and response is native to many different cultures in Africa as well as Indigenous cultures here in Canada. It's all interconnected. So when we go back to those First Peoples principles of learning that are gifted to us from the Coast Salish people, it is also interconnected with African Indigenous ways of knowing and showing up. So centering all Indigenous worldviews and making those connections explicit for our students. Major units of study, we looked at ancient African empires and Caribbean indigenous languages, heroes and rebellions of the African enslavement era, Black settlements in Canada, and contemporary issues within Black society. Looking at African empires, we did several different activities. I'm just going to skip ahead because, like I said, lots to talk about, not so much time. And one of the major projects of this unit was for the students to construct a building, because we made our own city, based off of African architectural styles.
Okay,
Can you hear?
This is our project, and as you can see, it kind of has a square shape as well as a central courtyard, and I really enjoyed kind of...
Oh, and that's that. Oh. Okay, this is what she's saying. So that project was great because it allowed students to tap into various different literacies and interests. So we've got science, the physics of building, the math of measuring everything, the creative aspects as well, and then the histories and exploring the richness and genius that existed in ancient Africa in terms of how they were building their societies, their homes, their buildings. Moving forward, we studied heroes and rebellions of the slave trade. So just quick question, why do you think it was important for me to flip this narrative? To speak to our? Absolutely, to speak to our strength. When we talk about slavery in this period in history, it seems as if we present a narrative in which Africans accepted this as their reality, as this is what it is. When in fact there were so many rebellions, revolts, uprising, ways in which African people resisted this reality. And that is what I needed my Black students to know. We didn't just accept this, but also my non-Black students to know as well. There was a resistance that existed here. And this history was hard to go through. It was difficult. It demanded a lot of patience and recognizing where your own positionality. And after doing that, the students created a graphic novel. So in addition to the historical piece, we also looked at Afrofuturism. We see Wakanda, or not Wakanda, Black Panther 2, the trailer just came out. I don't know if anyone has seen it. Very exciting, but it's real. That majesty, that power that existed, that Afrofuturist lens, we can apply that to these situations as well. And so that's what I asked my students to do. They adopted that lens, they understood what Afrofuturism is, and they created graphic novels about particular events and heroes and rebellions during the slave trade era. I said that information isn't just for you. How are you sharing this? So these graphic novels, we shared them out with their elementary schools. So all of their schools have a copy of this novel. So we have representation, positive representation of this period in elementary school. So again, ensuring that we're flipping the narrative and making it accessible. Next, we studied different Black Canadian settlements, and that allowed them to explore the archival process and understand that archiving also contains its own biases. So we looked at Little Burgundy, Africville, Hogan's Alley, Salt Spring, and I'm missing one, Amber Valley in Alberta. Finally, a big part of this course was taking up space and giving back to the Black community. So we went to several different museums, galleries, invited activists and community leaders into the classroom, supported Black entrepreneurs and organizations, because courses like this, I was lucky enough to have some funding, so how am I reinvesting in the community and exposing my students to Black leaders that are right here at home? We don't need to look much further than our own backyard to see excellence in leadership and different ways in which they can show up in being a young Black Canadian. So beside the pictures here are just reflections that the students had written about their experiences in different field trips. This one was the Sankofa exhibit, which was called African Roots, R-O-O-T-S, Canadian Roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, kind of cool. At the Museum of Anthropology. And then this was at the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Jan Wade exhibition, which was the first time a Black woman had a solo exhibition at the at the Art Gallery of Vancouver. Finally, my most favorite part of this course was our showcase. So at the end of the year, the students put on a soiree for parents that had three-ish pieces to it. The first piece was a museum. So they decided what pieces of their learning they wanted to share with their families and friends and put on an entire display within the hallways of the school. Secondly, we invited all the parents into the auditorium and we displayed again different aspects of our learning. This was really fun because we worked with the music department. They were playing songs and singing songs that were exclusively written and performed by Black artists. And tying into or piecing in that joy, the students did a lot of fun things. So they taught their parents and the guests how to do the electric slide and the wobble, for example. So different ways that they're engaging with this and sharing their knowledge with others, with the larger community, and changing also for a lot of Black students their experience in this school. To see themselves centered and uplifted was very important for me, especially our younger students, our grade 8 students. I made a point of calling them out to let them know, this is yours. This is what you can do. This is how you can show up for yourselves in your community and be celebrated and contribute in a positive way. The last bit that I'd just like to share with you folks today is my student at the showcase speaking about their experience in the class, just to center their voice instead of mine. Hopefully you can.
We'd like to introduce a few of our fellow classmates to explain why they decided to take this course, and yeah. So please welcome Quincy, Simon, Connor, and Louie.
Hey, how are you guys doing tonight? You guys like the showcase? Beginning? Yeah? So I'm Quincy, and BC Black History is a course that focuses on the contemporary historical issues Black people face, but most importantly, how they intertwine and impact the world today. It is the first course I have taken that is centered around Black history and the Black experience. While we did talk about some harder topics, such as the destruction of many Black communities like Amber Valley, Hogan's Alley, and Africville, we spent most of our class time discussing Black excellence. Black excellence is a term that emerged during the Black Power movement in the 1970s that can be defined as high level of achievement, success, or ability demonstrated by a Black person or by Black people in general. In some cases, the term is used to refer to an aspiration or goal to be achieved, or a mindset used in pursuit of such success. The theme of Black excellence came up in almost every unit we did, which I found amazing. I'm used to only hearing about the colonial lens of Black history, especially in my humanities and socials courses, like the transatlantic slave trade, or the surface level history. Classes would never dive deep into the history of Black Canadians, until now. I think seeing Black history reflected in the curriculum of this course in such an empowering way had a positive impact on Black students, such as myself. I saw Black people as heroes and change makers. I learned about the contributions of Black settlers, athletes, scientists, and rebellion leaders. This course was unlike anything I had ever done before. It was finally a class where I felt like the history of the Black community was being upheld and it was necessary to learn and understand. I am so excited to see the positive impact a course like this one will have on future students. Thank you.
Okay, we will stop it there. Thank you so much for listening and your attention. I really appreciate sharing all this with you. Thank you.
First, I want to say this is my first time way out east. I'm from Saskatchewan, so this is really cool. And just being from Saskatchewan, there's not a lot of people who are collaborating on work like this. So to be out here and to see all the people doing all different things to progress our community, and for people who look like us, it's inspiring, and it not only gives me confidence, but it reaffirms the work that I'm doing and the work that we're doing. So yeah, I just want to say thank you guys for that. But originally, I was born in South Africa. At a time where, racial tensions were high, and so was racial diversity. There were so many different ethnicities. There was the Boers who settled in the early 1600s and basically ran the politics and agricultural lands from that point on. And then there was the Bantu people who we know have migrated from Western Africa from way before. And there was also people who they called the coloreds, who were ethnically diverse people, a small minority of people, in South Africa. So then you come to Canada and they call you the coloreds. It's, it's kind of interesting, the identity, the way that we characterize and identify Black culture. And so for me, I was born in 93, so right after apartheid, when all of that was starting to change. And when I went to school, the dominating image and ideology that you would see was obviously Nelson Mandela. His face was everywhere. His voice was everywhere. Everything that he did was on camera and recorded, right? So his ideologies really like stand firm in my mind. And then moving to Canada in 2002, I was 10, 11 years old. The history that you learn is completely different. You know, you learn about Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain, how they were the first to establish, you know, in Canada, first contact with the indigenous. You know, they call Samuel de Champlain the father of Quebec, right? So a lot of the history that you start to learn is much more Eurocentric focused as opposed to learning about everybody's history. And you also learn about, you know, the English and the French, the war that they had, and how you have to fight for the French language, continue to, you know, speak French in minority situations because for a long time they have been the minority in this country, you know, and they have been the one discriminated against. And so you learn about all of those things, and then you also learn about the European sustainability in, you know, -50 weather in Saskatchewan. I don't know about you guys, but it gets like -50. That's like normal for us. And people go to work and go to school like it's nothing. It's crazy. It doesn't make sense, but you get used to it and you adapt, right? So part of that, you learn that, oh, they came early and they used all the tools and they established the cities and the farming culture through the winter. And you learn about the Ukrainians and how, you know, pierogies are a big deal. And so you come to Saskatchewan, you find a good Saskatchewan meal, it's pierogies and it's cabbage rolls. That's like a good Saskatchewan meal, right? You learn about all of those things. And then, sorry. So you learn about when Canada was established, which obviously was in anybody. There you go, 1867. Somebody knows, right? But so you learn that that's when Canada was established, 1867. You know, they signed the documents. Now French and English are the dominating, you know, beliefs and ideologies in Canada, and that's what happened. And then all from a world perspective, just going to skip a couple. So on the world perspective, you learn about how Christopher Columbus, like all of you guys, sailed the 7 seas and found all of the Americas. And, you know, if it wasn't for him, none of us would be here and none of this would be here. You know, and we learn about all of those things. And then also all the European empires that existed during that time, the Greek Empire, the Persian Empire, you know, the Roman Empire. And so me, like as a kid, they used to call me Curious Chris, and I'm learning all of this history. And as you can imagine, what I'm thinking, I'm like, where are all the black people at this time? What happened to them? And so that question wasn't answered for me in school. I had to go out on my own and find the answers of where black people were at that, because apparently they didn't exist, right? So at that time, I had to start doing my own history and start doing my own research, and that's kind of where my journey began, right? So what is the history of black people in Canada? That was the first question I had, and I wanted to know, you know, when did they come? At what point? And of course, Black History Month comes around and we learn about slavery and how black people struggled and they ran to the north, and once they crossed the north they were free and everything was great. And that's what we were learning. The Underground Railroad led to the, you know, just follow the North Star and as a black person everything will be all right. I mean, look at our communities, right? So you learn all of those things as a kid, and you start to wonder if that's the reality, because that's not the reality of what we're seeing in our society. And as I grew into reading and all of those things, I started to understand that history just repeats itself, and there's a cycle that we are, not us, but we're continuing as a society, and nobody's doing anything to stop it. And so first I started to find out about all of the different people who had an impact in establishing what we have today as Canada. And so now as part of our organization, we go around to different stakeholders, businesses, and we put these images up and we ask them, who are these people? And a lot of the times they can't even, I think I put 10 up there, they can't even go through all of these people who have had a very real impact in establishing the country that we have today, right? So on the very top left, you have Matthew de Costa, and you learn about Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain. But at the very same time, Mathieu de Costa was on those ships with them. He was the one translating with the indigenous and communicating because he was so well educated and knew multiple languages, right? But we just erased him from the history books, right? And then Lincoln Alexander, and obviously, I'm hoping that all of you guys know everybody up on here. So I don't have to do my teacher test and call people out, do I? No. But up there, especially in terms of the prairies, you have people like, John Ware, who you guys heard about, and then William Beale, Billy Beale, who was just a normal guy who immigrated to the prairies and lived normal prairie lives. And obviously the number 2 construction battalion and Mifflin Mr. Gibbs, who is fundamental to British Columbia being a province today, right? So you start to read the history books and you see all of the contributions that black people have made from the east to the west, right? And you ask yourself, how come nobody talks about them? And I mean nobody, right? We mentioned a few, right? Lincoln Alexander, like people who have had to go above and beyond to be great. We'll talk about them. We just recently did a story on Samuel Watts, who was also a creator. He made a pen holder, and most of his ideas were stolen. So he would bring them to a lawyer, and the lawyer would take his ideas and flip them, and all of a sudden, somebody else is recorded for having, made this thing. And so he made songs and published them himself, right? And so his songs went all over Canada during the early 1800s, and he was very popular. And so the thing that's interesting about him is that he was able to be successful despite people trying to make them fail, right? And so these are the people that we recognize in history who have had to go above and beyond. But what are the people who have made regular contributions every single day? And so like John Ware, for example, we have Stampede and Agribition. I don't know if you guys know about that, but it's this big fair where they do cowboy stuff, tackle cows and ride horses and things like that. And it was initiated because of John Ware. He was the one out there doing that stuff and bringing cattle up from the United States. But we never contribute to Alberta and Saskatchewan being a farming country today. And again, those were always my questions, like why is that? Why is that the case that these people have done such amazing things, and throughout Canada they've virtually been erased from the history books? And then you come across a document like this from the Governor General of Canada, and basically it says, for a period of 1 year from hereafter, the landing in Canada shall be, and the same is prohibited of any immigrants belonging to the Negro race, which race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirements of Canada. So that's a document that you find, right, that was signed. And so when you read something like that, I go further back and I look at the United States and how big of an impact the Emancipation Proclamation had in 1863. It not only affected how black people were seen in the United States, but in Canada as well. And so the Emancipation Proclamation led way to the Reconstruction period, where they had to figure out, what do we do with these people who were slaves, but now all of a sudden they're free, right? And so in the prairies from Oklahoma, these Oklahoma farmers, they were promised land in Oklahoma. Obviously, they were given the worst of the land. And coincidentally, they heard about the Last Best West. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Last Best West, but it was a time when they were making calls for people to come immigrate to the prairies. Like, ain't nobody trying to live in the cold, so anybody come, please, right? That was the call that was made. And guess who caught wind of these? Black people. And so they saw these promotions for the Last Best West, and guess what they did? They settled up in communities, as you guys have here today, and they made the trek to the prairies. But when they got there, right, so when they got there, a lot of them were rejected, a lot of them were turned away, families were separated. And so this was about from the 1890s to 1911, when they realized that black people were coming in a large numbers to settle in the prairies, and that's what they didn't want. And so the permeating thought, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this article that was written by a doctor. His name was Dr. James Hunt. This was in the 1500s. He wrote a scholarly article about black people, and it was titled "The Negro's Place in Nature." And so if you read it, you see the ideology that was starting to form in the 1500s about black people. You know, they're not smart. You know, you could treat them like cattle. The whole reason that they turned them into slaves, right? That ideology started to become formed in the 1500s. And so it was permeating and dominating in the prairies in the 1900s. So something that was written that early on still continued on. So for about 300-400 years, that this article was being passed around about black people's place in society and who they were. And so you read that and you see articles like this, and you start to understand that the perception that people have had of us back then still exists today. And so when you teach the history the wrong way, all of those ideologies continue to persist. And so I realized as an educator, my responsibility was to tell the stories and to make sure that it wasn't erased from history. And so I asked myself, well, where do you start when you start to tell the story, the black story? And it's obvious you start in Africa, right? And even going into not this Africa that we see, but the real Africa. Right? So I often show my kids this map, and they're able to name all of the countries that have colonized Africa. But then I show them images like this, and they have no idea who this is, right? This is Shaka Zulu, and somebody who is very, very fundamental to South Africa and even just the art of fighting, right? The bull formation. And then I show them images like this, and they have no idea what this is, right? And so I'm originally from Congo. That's where my parents are from, my ancestors as well. And we're from the Luba tribe. These are the Baluba people, right? They're very artistic and big into the arts. And so that's part of my family history and my family heritage. And so you also learn about the Moors, you know, and the Maasai warriors, and the Mali Empire. We're talking about Sandia Dakata, the richest person to ever exist, Mansa Musa, right? That's where you start when you talk about the history of black people, is that we came way before colonization even existed, even happened. Is that there's a very rich culture, rich history that we all know that isn't being written down, that is hard to find. Most of the black history that we find starts from this period, right? When people found Africa or found Africans who were walking around basically naked, who didn't know what they were doing, right? And they basically civilized these people. And so you see the triangle trade, how that is now our history. And all of the things that existed before that never even happened. And so now this becomes our history, right? And we learn about how it was the Europeans who came to Africa and taught them math and taught them how to read and taught them things about algorithms, right? But the reality is, it was the Europeans who were going to Africa to learn from the Africans. Right? But that isn't the dominant ideology in our society, but how we start to turn that is by telling the real history and telling the real stories, not the one that starts from this time period, right? And so a lot of the work that I do is debunking the history that we know, the history that we've learned from 1911, that they were able to essentially create a curriculum that told us a story about who we are, where we come from, and what our identity is. And so when you start to buy into that, you see kids and you see communities that are unsuccessful and don't thrive. When the reality is, when you look at the history of Afriqueville, or you look at the Oklahoma farmers who settled in the prairies, and Amber Valley, and even the African kingdoms that you look at, it was based off of community and supporting one another. But then you end up in the prairies in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where you hear things like, black people live over there, right? But the reality is when black people get there, they're forced to assimilate, or they won't make it in the society, right? And so they assimilate, and black societies, black communities aren't allowed to develop and to thrive. So to come here and to see that there are still black communities around, I'm like, that's crazy, right? Because in the prairies, we're still struggling to establish a black community and what that even looks like, right? Because as you can see, after 1970s, they finally removed the Immigration Act, and that's when the influx of immigrants started to come from Africa, from the Caribbeans, from the United States, right? And so you have this melting pot of a community that isn't allowed to thrive together, right? And so a lot of the work that I do, again, is to just, again, trying to establish a black community, number one, and then telling our story, because there is power in the story that we tell, right? And as we see, right, there's redemption and resiliency from all of these people. And although these could be great starting points, right, they're just a small narrative in a larger story. So that's what I encourage teachers to learn about, and I try to teach my students about, especially at my school. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you guys for taking time to listen to me.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this important symposia to really think about Black history in Canada, and then also to think about, Black history in relation to STEM in Canada. And just to give you a little bit about myself, is that I am from the Caribbean community, but I grew up in the United States, was born and raised in the United States, and so now I'm here in Canada. I also have a lot of relatives that immigrated to Canada, and so as some of my colleagues in the States, when we talk about Blackness, we're like, it really doesn't, respect borders. And, the Black is not defined by borders. And I know Catherine McKittrick, who's a, Canadian geographer, and she's also Black, and she speaks about that a lot, about how our Blackness is defined outside of those borders, and how those European borders definitely continue to restrict who we are, and even the ways that we're defined. So today what I wanted to talk about was looking at Black joy, specifically in STEM education. And just to give you a brief overview, I felt that because of the context of this conference, it was good to just briefly historicize STEM. And just a disclaimer is that I'm not a historian, but I have looked at stuff like in relation to STEM, because it's been very important to think about, well, what is that underlies STEM? Being influenced by like critical race theory, where you start to really look at those underlying structures, because in order for you to be able to change things, you really have to know what's there to begin with. Okay, so brief historicizing of STEM. Then I come to the notions of both the historical present and present future. And for those, I thank my students. One recently graduated, Robert Robertson, and one is going to graduate, Latoya Strong, because they've been talking a lot about Tina Camp. I think she's also a historian or an English rhetorician, but she's a Black Black feminist, and talks about futurity. And so the way that they've been talking about her work has really inspired me, again, to think deeply about this notion of the historical present and the present future if we're thinking about STEM education, especially for Black and other racialized students. So one of the things that with my group, those same students and other students as well, we talked about what we call the neoliberal enclosure of STEM, where STEM is like becomes this plots of exclusive ownership that is very limiting, not only to who is able to participate in STEM, but also in the ways that people benefit from STEM. And this narrowing of STEM, it influences curricular, and it influences that the ways that STEM education is taught and the availability of it, especially when you're thinking about schools in racialized areas. And, you know, and a lot of because a lot of my experience in schooling and dealing with schools has been in New York City, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based on that, but in what I'm learning, well, basically STEM, I mean global, you know, it's kind of the same subject that we're talking about, but just in different contexts. So, you know, speaking of algorithms, again, like if you do a Google search of scientists, these are the types of images that show up. One of the good things is that now there are more diverse scientists. They're not just all white male. So you see a diversity of scientists. But you still will look and see that there is something that I find is very stark about these images, is that they're all very clean. They're very sanitized, you know. And this is just giving you the notion that science, first of all, like it's acultural. You know, aside from like maybe the visible, you know, presence of different skin tones, you don't see anything that's different about the people who are participating in there. So it's acultural. It's objective. It's in these very clean white labs. You know, it's neutral. It's disconnected. There's no emotion or lived experience there, and it's unitary, like only one way of being and doing science. So right away, you're still getting that notion that you have, in order for you to participate in science, you have to assimilate into this way of being and doing in science. And that way of being and doing in science, we have to think about, well, where does that come from? Why is it that now we feel that this is the way, like this is the image of science and scientists that we get? So just to expand a little bit, to go back to that notion of the historical present and the present future. So this again is coming from a feminist, black feminist, Tina Camp. And she talks about that notion of fugitivity or taking flight, because we often talk, like in the enslavement narratives about the fugitive slave, what were they fleeing for? They were looking for freedom. So it's like a signature idiom, and it talks about like designing or getting your own meaningful pathways and finding your own ways in and through different types of experience. So with the historical present, what she talks about is really how history shapes what we see today, but we are still living in that history. We're still like, you know, thinking about, you know, or using those narratives as a way to think about how we are in the present. And this is not to say that we need to forget about those narratives, but what she talks about is the future present is where, and she goes into a whole discussion about, you know, tenses and grammar and things like that. And when you listen to it, it makes sense, but I'm not even going to try to do any justice and like, you know, repeat what she says today. But what the future present is really about thinking that fugitivity, because the reason why you escaped, you know, these horrors of enslavement is because you knew that this was not what was meant to be, and this is not how it should be. So you're living that future that you want for yourself in the now when you take that escape. So what she urges us to think about is to believe in what should be true for Black liberation, what it is, what not is, but what should be true, and living this truth in the present. So when we start to think about science and science education, how can we truly live in that future presently in science education? So before I talk about some thoughts around that, just wanted to go back a little bit to think about first the historical present and what underlies STEM education. Because again, a lot of us continue to think that STEM is this very neutral and objective place, but it is really not. It is coming from a specific culture and a specific worldview. So we think about the coloniality of Western science. While science, as we know it, predates that age of enlightenment, it was not the European miracle as we are often taught in schools. When it coalesced into how we know it today, it was during the project of colonization and imperialization. So during this time, Europeans erased people, knowledges, resources, everything. Reclassified things, because I think, again, I started out in biology, and you think about the way things are classified and why we use Latin names and everything. And I always thought, well, why don't we just use the names that people, call these things, and then they give you the whole thing, then you wouldn't understand what somebody else is talking about. But, and so they reclassify them, recategorize them into these different things or these relationships that don't really make sense in nature. I mean, yes, people that maybe study, genetics and all that kind of stuff, it makes sense in that evolutionary tree sense, but not in how these beings that have been reclassified exist in nature. And then renaming. That whole notion of naming is a powerful thing, whether it's a naming of places, a naming of objects, and renaming them so that they can be in a particular order and they can be controlled and then somehow monetized. One historian, Crosby, referred to this as like the portmanteau biota. It's the biological colonization and invasion of Europeans. The domestic animals, plants, pathogens, and vermins that were spread around the globe, often upsetting the balance of endemic ecosystems. So one of my students, she talked about this, and I wish the plant, what is the name of the plant again, that can help with, there was something that all of the Europeans were afflicted with. It might have been smallpox, but just forgive me, because this is something she just presented to me and I read about it, but how they started to plant this plant in different places to see how it can grow because they needed to turn it into medicine. And then I talked to her about sugarcane, and it's the same thing when Europe developed this appetite for sugar and how they planted sugarcane all over the world, in order for this sugar to be refined and then sent back to Europe and then turned into some type of profit. So then we also think about this notion, thinking about the Western modern science and race science, because the Western modern science, so it became this objective truth, and then this was then used to define racial groups of people. And so Terence Keel, and this is a book that I came across when somebody who retired cleaned out their office and was like, oh, table of free books. And I'm like, oh, this looks like a great book. And sure enough, it really is. It's a recently written book. And what this author, and he's also a historian, does is to think about how Christian thought underlies Western modern science and then became racial science. So describing secularization not as a rupture of the past, but a transference of religion forms into non-religious forms of thoughts and practice. And he calls this notion of it's Christian supersessionism, and it affects the way that the types of questions that science asked and the tools that are used to answer them. So if you're again thinking about that notion of, science that's in the institution versus science as indigenous people around the world have practiced throughout history very differently, but they're all for the purpose of addressing answers, but think about which one gets rarefied and which one gets considered, superstition. So I also looked at Sylvia Wynter because when I thought about the race science, it's how this became this descriptive statement of man. So white, Homo economicus became that which defined human, and everybody else, including white women, were defined in relation to this Homo economicus. So I like where she puts it, the descriptive statement is determinate of the higher order learning that must take place. So learning all across society is served in this function of maintaining this descriptive statement. So sometimes when we talk about, we need to decenter the human, it's important to think about, well, what description of human are we considering in that? And so this is just more about that, the normalized man, and then I just underline that part, then the struggle of our times is a struggle against this overrepresentation of man. And how does this show up in education and in pathways in and through STEM? Unequal access to education, hostile school and work environments, unequal opportunities for advancement. And I found this very interesting that, and I'll just read that abstract analysis of data from nearly all U.S. PhD recipients in the sciences and their dissertations across 3 decades, demographically underrepresented students innovate at higher rates than majority students, but their novel contributions are discounted and less likely to earn them academic positions. That descriptive statement of human determines now who can do science, who is considered knowledgeable, and whose knowledge is considered worthy of passing on. The way that it affects society, medical experimentations, environmental racisms, health equity, affects artificial intelligence, and I know I'm just running through these right now. Racial stereotypes, you can read the headline, racial false beliefs about biological differences, and that contributes to Black people not receiving adequate amounts of pain medication in hospital. Okay, so I'll skim through this, but what's important, what we need to do is to think about, first of all, why is science like this? Because it is in that particular history and culture. And why is it important for us to change this is because when you think in the basic sense, who is asking? Who are the scientists that are asking the questions? And how are they going to be meaning and relevant? One example that, that came out of this book is that, we always think about those primate studies. Most of the early primate behavior studies were done by white men. And they used it was like through their Darwinian, Christian supersessionism lens. And they viewed everything as competition, and the females, the males would fight for the females, or the females would go to the more dominant ones. And they did not have that idea that females played a more agentic role, an active role in pursuing partners until female scientists came around. And what did women see that men miss? And they said when a woman say a female lemur or bonobo denominated a male, a female langur left her group to solicit, to solicit strange males, a woman, female, will follow her. So there's this notion of empathy, which is not talked about in science, where you have that empathy where there's a certain part of you that relates to what you're studying, so you're going to use that empathy to ask questions and as a lens with which to analyze your data, thereby contributing to a broader knowledge now of what we know of primate behavior, for example. People may have seen this going around. Medical student creates a handbook for diagnosing conditions in Black and brown skin. Another medical illustrator, this was going around the internet, and people were shocked because another thing we take for granted when you're teaching science is always this like Caucasian body that's rolled into the lab, and then you look at the body or you look at the chart. So again, that's normalizing that descriptive statement. Okay, so what I started to do, so just briefly, just because I'm almost at the edge of time, is to look at how can we change this if we think about spaces, rather education as being spaces of violence. Where and when were there aspects of Black joy that, and there was a few slides that I slipped to get to this point, but I just wanted to get to explain what I'm considering Black joy. So what I did was I started to think about the places that I've either taught myself, the research that I've done, looking for spaces of Black joy to begin to articulate what are those things that we must consider where students can be, engaged in science learning in joyful, pleasurable spaces that value who they are, their identities, their cultures, their worldview as Black students and as youth. So I came up with 4 different things, and it's not exhaustive. So Black excellence, positive associations with science learning. So thinking about one of my student teachers, when she would take her kids to field trips, she would make sure that they were field trips like to the local community college to participate in college events where they saw Black students who were scientists or Black scientists on the stage, asking and answering questions, giving them the opportunities to participate in these, in these spaces as legitimate science knowledgeable, science identified students, Black inventiveness, creative engagement in science learning. I can talk about the fidget spinners that I did because I had this all little neat activity laid out. As soon as I put them out on the tables, the kids went for it. They were taking out their cell phones, doing videos to see which kinds of fidget spinners would spin faster or slower. They were trading them across groups. They were timing them. They were doing all of this emergent science learning without being prompted. Sorry. Okay, Black kinship. I, talk about the way, and I do have this article published about the way that one Caribbean teacher uses language in her classroom as a way of centering and fostering relationship and trust. Black aesthetics, the way that we show up, especially for important occasions, dressed up in, whether it's Afrocentric wear, special hairdos, jewelry, all of those types of things. And then I just noted that Black aesthetics was probably few and fleeting because a lot of our learning spaces are not safe enough for Black learners for it to be all the time. Okay, so just the last state, in all of these spaces that I found were moments where students, as Black or young people, where their cultural resources were normalized as, as learning affordances, and thinking about Black livingness and looking at our social lives in order to advance theories about learning. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I first want to thank you for having me here. I'm Leslie, and I'm here to talk today about incorporating culturally sustaining pedagogy in STEM education using Dr. Dolana Mogedime's reflection cycle. So first, I need to acknowledge my presence today on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, both the land I have the privilege of presenting on today and the land that I have the privilege of teaching on at home in Ontario, remains a home to a diverse population of Indigenous people. And I recognize that I must continue to learn more about the rich history of this land so I can better understand my role as a settler, as a resident, a neighbor, a partner, a caretaker, and maybe even most importantly, as a teacher. So who am I? I'm a PhD student at Brock University. My research mainly focuses on ensuring that Black and other global majority students feel represented and included in STEM education. Maybe more importantly today, I'm also a veteran secondary school teacher, so I'm going into year 22. Yes, I was very young when I started. And I've almost always taught in STEM. I primarily teach grade 12 pre-university level bio. I'm also the science department head, so I'm very lucky to have the opportunity to lead our science department, which includes chemistry, physics, bio, and physical education. I feel like I have to discuss my positionality because I'm standing in front of you as a white woman talking about educating Black students. So I hold tremendous privilege as a white, cis, straight, English as a first language speaking, and educated woman. As a teacher of Black students, I have to be aware of my privilege and how it affects the kids in my classroom and what I'm teaching them. And I often equate privilege to blinders. So for those of you who aren't horse people, I'm not a horse person either, but I know this. They often put pieces of leather on either side of their faces. And so the horses look straight when they're racing. They're not distracted about what's around them. And to my mind, this is a really good simile for privilege. So I've had the additional privilege of being educated by Black feminists, including Dr. Dolana Mogedime, who is my PhD advisor. Her teaching and guidance has completely changed how I approach my pedagogy. She was able to help me take those blinders away at least a little bit so I can be more aware of what my students are facing. As I work towards ensuring my Black students see themselves represented within the STEM classroom, I'm going to talk about her reflection cycle. So for those of you who were lucky enough to hear her speak yesterday, she spoke about her reflection cycle, and I'm going to tell you today how I incorporated it. So the whiteness of teaching, or why is a white woman standing up here talking? In Ontario, statistics are not kept on the race of teacher candidates or teachers themselves. Dr. Wright talked earlier about issues around databases and race. Well, in Canada, we just pretend race doesn't exist in a lot of situations, which means we don't know what the numbers are. However, if you look around Ontario, the vast majority of educators are white women. Abawi found that 90% of school administrators in Ontario are white, and in the 2016 census, Turcotte found that only 1.8% of teachers in Canada are black. And what this means is the majority of students are being taught by white women. So how can we make sure that the white women are doing a good job teaching our black students? Bell Hooks, who I call my Lord and Savior, said, "A teacher who is unaware that he or she is behaving in a manner that is wounding or dehumanizing, when confronted, is likely to alter the behavior." And I believe this in my soul. Teachers don't want to be bad teachers. You don't get into teaching for ego. You don't get into teaching for the summer vacations, no matter what the premiers would have you believe. You get into teaching because you love kids. And that means loving every child in front of you. So if we can teach our white teachers to make sure that our black students are included and loved, they'll go. They'll work towards having anti-oppressive, anti-racist classrooms. So this is a way I hope to move forward towards that. So why use a reflection cycle? Well, it helps you just to be a better teacher, period. So for white teachers, unconscious bias is baked in. We are part of Canadian society, which is founded in white supremacy. Education is founded in white supremacy, at least in Canada. So using reflection cycle helps you to break out of that white supremacy. It allows you to critically analyze both the curriculum and how you're teaching it. It encourages innovation. And STEM is a really interesting area because we believe in the ontology of scientism, which basically means STEM is objective. We're not subjective like those other artsy-fartsy areas. Everything in STEM is fact, and that's garbage. Of course we are just as subjective, but we deny it. And we deny it from the hills. And because of that, we don't reflect. We simply say, peer-reviewed studies, done. Using reflection cycle means that we step back and we look critically at the science and the way that we teach it. So this is Dr. Mogadime's cycle, and I'm going to go through it step by step with how I'm using it. So you begin with a question that interests you or that you're concerned about. And my biggest concern is I teach at an international school. Pre-COVID, we had 72 countries. I'm often the only white person within my classroom. And I do a lot to try and teach in a way that's anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and inclusive. But the bottom line is I can't embody representation for my students. No matter what I do, I'm still a white woman standing in front of global majority students. So I wanted to know, as a white teacher, how can I ensure that my black students see themselves represented in our classroom and in STEM education? So the next step in the cycle is investigate through findings, resources, and through finding resources and readings. So the first piece there, I thought, was acknowledging the white supremacy in the sciences. And I thought, great, I'm going to talk about the harms, all the white supremacy that science, all the harms that the white supremacy in science has caused. I'm going to talk about the nutrition experiments that were conducted on Indigenous children in residential schools. I'm going to talk about the Tuskegee experiment, where black men were infected with syphilis and then not treated, all of that without their consent. I'm going to talk about Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were literally stolen. I mean, they were taken originally for, as she was being treated for cancer, but then they were stolen and used for medical experimentation and are still being used. Her cell line is still being used today. And then I thought, what's this going to teach my kids except that they don't belong in sciences? That sciences is oppressive and awful and not a place that they should be. That's the exact opposite of what I want to teach them. So I started looking at STEM identity, which is a socially based identity grounded in the extent that individuals see themselves and are accepted as a member of STEM discipline or field. Kim and all came up with that in 2018. So that led me to culturally sustaining pedagogy. So I know that earlier today, Dr. Bonner discussed culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy and her move to culturally responsive pedagogy. Responsible pedagogy. Culturally sustaining pedagogy goes along the same lines. So it was coined by Paris in 2012. And it requires that educators support young people in sustaining the cultural and linguistic competence of their communities, while simultaneously offering access to dominant cultural competence. In other words, I need to show my students that they're not just accepted in science, they're essential in science. Dr. Adams referenced that the study that talked about the amazing discoveries that are found by historically excluded groups in science. And part of the reason is we've discounted everything that these communities bring to us. My students don't just belong, they are necessary because their perspectives enhance science. They've been missing because they've been excluded. And when we use culturally sustaining pedagogy, I can make sure that they go to university and they excel, which is key. But I can also make sure that they know that they are so needed. What? Now I've got to touch buttons. Okay, so the next step. You theorize on teaching and learning approaches. So I sat down and I thought, what can I incorporate into the curriculum? I still have to teach the Ontario curriculum. There's no choice there. But what can I add? What can I change in my pedagogy as I teach? What has to remain the same? So for me, I had to make sure that when they go off to university next year and a prof says, tell me about the Calvin cycle, they can still name off all the enzymes. And then I have to constantly analyze how this might affect my students. And it goes back to that blinders piece that I told you about with my privilege. So I've got to try and remove those blinders to try and look at how this is going to affect my students before I present it to them. So next step, expand knowledge and understanding. So the focus is on incorporating Black representation within my course. And after talking to Delano, we thought that research on Black nurses as trailblazers within Canada would be a great start. So we started off looking at Beverly Salmon. So I pulled Dr. Karen Flynn's book, which if you haven't read it is amazing, called Moving Beyond Borders, A History of Black, Canadian, and Caribbean Women in the Diaspora. From there, again, Delana and I went to the Clara Thomas Archives and Special Collections at York University in Toronto, and we were actually able to get access to the Beverly Salmon papers. All of her archives are stored there. So we were able to go through that and look at all the information we could find about her. Next step, what conclusions did you arrive at? Well, Beverly Salmon was remarkable. So she started as a nurse, but she then became a Toronto City Councillor and did amazing things in the political field. So while she's a remarkable person, not necessarily the best example for my science students. So back to previous step rather. So I wanted to expand my knowledge and understanding again. So I returned to Dr. Flynn's book and looked for suggestions, and she started speaking about Lily Johnson. So I dug a little deeper. Lily Johnson was a nurse in Ontario. She was the first Black director of public health in Ontario and the founder of the Sickle Cell Association of Ontario. And I went, oh my goodness, this fits with what I teach. This is an example of a remarkable person that I can provide representation for my students with, so let's go. So what I did is I wrote a case study, and this is just the first couple pages. Reminding myself that culturally sustaining pedagogy requires both aspects. We gave the representation, and then I go on. The next part of the case study talks about Mendelian genetics and sickle cell trait. And then the last piece talks about stem cells and how we're now using stem cells as a treatment. So I'm obviously not going to read you the case study, but to give you a little bit about Lily Johnson, she was born in Jamaica and worked as a teacher in Jamaica. Yes! But she didn't like teaching. So she had a passion to be a nurse. So she went to Edinburgh, Scotland, became a nurse in Edinburgh, Scotland, worked in London, in Jamaica, America, before coming to Canada. When she came to Canada, big shock, her education was not recognized. So she had to write and pass her nursing exams here. She then went to U of T for her BSCN and further diploma in public health nursing, all while working full-time, including at Sick Kids Hospital. She became a master teacher at Humber College, the first, as I said, director of public health in Ontario, first Black director of public health in Ontario. And then, perhaps most importantly, after she retired, she formed the Sickle Cell Association of Ontario. The Sickle Cell Association of Ontario was instrumental in having newborn genetic testing put into place for every baby born in Ontario. And it's not just for sickle cell disease, it's for 30 genetic disorders. So those children are able to receive treatment preventatively and hopefully never experience the effects of their genetic diseases. She very literally has changed life for thousands and thousands and thousands of Ontarians. So, next step, what conclusions did you arrive at? I looked at the profile and thought, oh yeah, this is an impressive person, and this is an example of Black excellence that I can provide to my students. And then I took it to Dolana and asked Dolana to look it over because, again, blinders, and Dolana gave me the approval, so I wrote the case study. And then once students work through the case study, I'll seek feedback from them with the knowledge that everything always can be made better. So hopefully my students will be able to tell me what they enjoyed, what they didn't enjoy, what they learned from, what they didn't learn from. Teenagers are remarkable creatures. They are honest, so they will tell me, and I can get it better. And then the next step is with renewed knowledge act. So my goal is always to refine and improve the curriculum. As the science department head, I'm working to encourage my teachers to incorporate culturally sustaining pedagogy into other STEM courses. And my fellow STEM teachers will recognize that this can be a little bit of a challenge. A lot of science teachers, in my opinion, are very set in, I teach science. And we don't teach science. We teach children. And we teach the children that are in front of us. And since in my school, the students in front of us are Black and global majority students, we need to teach science that reflects them. And then help support other teachers and staff working towards representation in classes. Going back to my privilege, I am very lucky to be able to do a PhD. And I have resources that aren't necessarily accessible to somebody who is just teaching. So being able to bring that back into my school and provide that, and I need to say having the administrative support to bring this into our school is an incredible privilege for me. The last piece is personal reflection on the process. So after we've gone through this, I need to look, do I believe this work is making a difference for my students? Because if it isn't, we need to find something else that will. Do I need to reframe and rewrite my question? What have been the challenges in implementing culturally sustaining pedagogy within the class? And obviously this is just one piece of culturally sustaining pedagogy. There's many others that we're trying to bring in. And how do the changes of this fit or change my professional identity as a teacher? So now that we're done the reflection cycle, I want to talk about a little bit about the difficulties. This is a lot of work. Okay, this is a lot of work, and we're asking teachers to go over and above. I have worries about not fully representing or leaving out cultures. I have worries about cultural appropriation on my part, and there's the need to take on critique, which can be hard. So with all of this, why am I asking teachers to do this? Well, this is the bottom line. Our Black students deserve teachers who love and respect them, and classrooms where they feel not only valued, but essential. So, thank you all very much. I'm very grateful that you joined me today and allowed me to present. And I'll just go through my references.
I can appreciate what you said about, being careful about courses being selective. I know in Nova Scotia we offer ACS, which is African Canadian Studies, also Mi'kmaq Studies and Canadian History. And students have a choice. They can choose any one of the three. And the French Immersion Program has been in Nova Scotia for well over 30 years, and our Black students who are in the French Immersion Program usually take Canadian history. So a couple of years ago, and if you were here yesterday, you would have heard Robin Brown speak. Robin was my student when she was in junior high. So anyway, it's great to have her now as a teacher in my school and now department head. But we solicited the Halifax Regional School Board to have ACS, African Canadian Studies, offered in French. And it took months and months for them to even listen to us. And when they finally did, we couldn't get a code. Kids were registering for courses, and we were afraid that we wouldn't be able to offer it for the next year. And then when we finally got a code, we had to worry about whether or not we were going to have materials translated in French. And anyway, when they sent out the announcement, it basically said, HRCE is going to be offering ACS in French, and with no regard to the fact that it was fought for by Dartmouth High School, and it was presented as though it was their idea. We're now offering it, so if there's any schools out there that would like to sign up for this, we'd love to offer it in your school, without, like I said, any regard to the fact that the idea started at Dartmouth High School. So yes, they will steal your ideas all the time. But I'm not here to present, so do you have any questions for any of the panelists? I guess you all did an excellent job in getting your points across because there's no questions to be asked. Thank you very much.